So hi, I'm Patricia Bubner, the CEO and co-founder of Orbillion Bio, and I'll talk a little bit about our perspective on cultivated meat and where my background is and the team's background and why we entered cultivated meat and what we are hoping to achieve. So what you see here is millet. I'm actually a trained chemical engineer, but the reason why I studied chemistry really was because I wanted to make food. Doesn't make a lot of sense in the first glance, but I really always from my childhood on had that idea of if we can just make nutritious food from scratch that is nutritious and healthy, then we could really make a change in the food industry. And that took me to a PhD in bioprocess engineering, and eventually I landed at UC Berkeley, where I met someone that shared this passion and that I actually did my postdoc with. And at that time, I also founded a food project, the Millet Project, where we developed plant-based food products and grew millet in California because at that time we were in a historic drought. And I love this quote from Peter Merriman about my heroes have always been farmers. At that time, I realized how important farmers are in our food system and how hard they work to make it work. And it's interesting when you think about how the world has changed since, for example, I was a child, and I'll let you guess when that was, but the amount of people that live on this planet now versus back then has doubled in that time. The world of my childhood is gone. And for me, it's really astounding how the more urbanized we get as people, and the more we go away from nature, the more we crave nature. And this was actually the picture of the nature photograph of the year recently, that recently came out. And when we think of nature and of animals, we often think of wild animals, of a huge diversity and huge amount of animals that roam free. And depending on where you live, of course, that's different types of animals, but I think that's what goes on in a lot of our minds. The reality, though, is that most of the mammals on this planet are livestock. We currently have over 1 billion cows alone on this planet, not even talking about all the pigs and chickens and so on. That is the reality that we're living in right now. And when we consume meat often, especially, I'm originally from Europe, from Austria, so we often think, oh, the meat that I buy is organic and comes from this small scale farmer, and I'm not part of this big industry. But we all are, whether in Europe or anywhere else in the world. The reality is that the number of small scale farmers has decreased drastically in the last, let's say, couple of decades by a factor of around 10. And we see a huge centralization of the food system. We see that farmers need to scale up in order to be able to meet the prices that consumers want or can pay for meat. And this is something that is becoming more and more of a problem, and more people realize that it's becoming a problem. I'm, of course, not telling you anything new when I speak to the impact that has not only on the environment, but also on the people that work in this business and the animals that live under these conditions. And if we just go a couple of decades back again, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Dust Bowl. And that was a very defining episode in the American recent farming history. And why did that happen? It happened because so many things at that time where we have a huge amount of land that we can use to grow food, and there was more and more need for food. But the farmers that worked the land worked it to get higher and higher yields out of it, and eventually depleted the soil. And that depleted soil, also land that used to be prairie and that was turned into farmland, in the end, didn't have the capacity anymore. There were no roots that could hold the soil in. So when the winds came, they would just carry the rest of the fertile soil away. In the end, people were starving, people were moving. It had a huge socioeconomic impact. And the dust cloud that you can see here came until Washington, D.C. And finally, then there were some policies made for change. And this was, for example, the story of that impact was also told in a very well-known novel that I can only recommend you read to understand better the history also of the impact of that. And I'm really happy to see that now we see more and more people, especially the younger generation, realizing the impact that our personal choices have, our food choices have on the environment, on the world as a whole. We all are living through a completely new period of time where we actually feel the impact of these food choices, especially if you live in California and haven't been out much since March, first because of COVID and then because of the fires. So we see that the consumers are becoming more interested and are becoming more aware. We see big brands like Impossible and Beyond coming with new products and people wanting to buy these products, and an increase in, for example, plant-based sales. And I love what earlier today, Casey from Memphis Meat said when she said, cultivated meat is not an or solution, it's an and solution. And at Orbillion Bio, we see it the same way. With cultivated meat, we can replace the significant amount of the meats that is being made in these high intensity feedlot-based animal agriculture. We hope to replace that. That also means that hopefully we can enable more of the regenerative farmers, the organic farmers, to work the land, that they can work in a way that is good for the land and that provides us with a side of other premium products from these farmers. So I really think that someone who buys a burger, let's say at a fast food restaurant, they don't care that much where that meat comes from. In that moment, maybe you're on a road trip, maybe you're just really hungry, you don't have time, you make a choice for something that's satiating and that tastes good. And if cultivated meat can deliver that, then I think we have a really good stance at convincing the customer. But there are, of course, more parts to that. And if we're thinking of making meat and making good meat, we need to talk to the experts. And one of these experts is someone you see here that you saw last year talking at the CMS. And he made a huge impression on me, not only because the deep decade-long knowledge in the meat business that he has, but also because for me, he is the phenomenon of something that people often do not see in a lot of the classical food business. There is a lot of a wanting to have more sustainable food products, to be a part of the new food movement. And we should partner with these people. And I'm so glad that Orbillion Bio has Guy Crims as their advisor, because if we want to make a meat product, we need to have the experts on our company advisory panel that know how to make good meat. Our background is mostly in science and technology and business development, but to understand what good meat is and how we can make good meat in cultivated meat, that's where we need the experts for, the farmers, the butchers, and everyone in the meat business. And of course, as a good Austrian, I also need to allude a little bit to the most prominent son of my hometown, the Terminator. Because speaking of utopia and maybe also a little bit of dystopia, it really is on us to define what the new food, any alternative protein, cultivated meat or other alternative proteins will be, what we make out of it and where we can carry it. That can be completely new compositions of food that we have never envisioned before. And I'm constantly really astounded by the creativity of the people in this space of putting new things out there. Speaking of utopia versus dystopia and where we want to take it, of course, this is a bioprocess. At Orbillion Bio, we're a team of scientists from biopharma and biotechnology with significant expertise in all parts of the necessary processes that the others outlined before me. And we are very aware of our role in making a safe and scalable product. If we want to see that future happening, the one thing that we need to remember is it is a consumer product that is being ingested. And with all the race of who is first in bringing this product out, there's one thing we should not forget, which is safety. And I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But if we think about cultivated meat as a product, and this is, for example, some muscle fibers that can be made already in the lab, then we can define how we will design these processes in order to get the products we want. That can be muscle fibers, that can be other things. One thing that is currently a problem is There is a lot of doubt from scientists if it is even worth spending all these resources on cultivated meat. That may be a little bit controversial, but there are people that say it will never reach price parity. It will never be something that is viable in the long run. And then as scientists, we really like to solve the most difficult problems. And making food just is too easy. You know, if you have a drug product or anything that has a very complicated mechanism of action, that's something that we scientists like. Making food, it really seems like not a hard enough problem to solve. From an engineering standpoint, and that's what cultivated meat is, it is an engineering problem. I think we need to solve a variety of problems, but we can solve them. But we need the scientists to also come into this field. So everyone that's listening right now that's thinking of coming into cultivated meat, we need you. We need more trained people. That's why we're actually also very active in different engagements with students and with nonprofit organizations in the field to make sure that we can get more smart people to this field that help us solve all these problems. And as was discussed before, the process itself is pretty defined. We need to scale up in order to really bring down the cost massively. We need scale. And that is a process that has been very well defined and is well understood in biopharma. There are, of course, some problems that are very specific and unique to cultivated meat. But that's something, again, that we need to have the capital and the skilled labor to solve. For example, one of the problems we see is currently there is a lack of standard for starting materials. There is not in the nascent cultivated meat industry, there is no agreement on what is the best cell type or cell line to use. And with some specific cell lines from different animals, there's also the problem that we don't know really a lot about them, and they're difficult to work with. So we have a need for really getting more knowledge on different species that people like to eat, getting more data about them, but also getting the, for example, growth factors or even the markers to identify, is this a muscle cell or what type of cell is that? And we are actively working towards creating such a standard in cultivated meat. Another thing that I think is really important is, if you are familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks and the cells that came from, that were taken from her tumor tissue, they were the first immortalized cell line. I don't want to touch on all the other issues that are associated with that. Please read that book. It's a very interesting story. But the lesson for us is that these first immortalized cells, in the end, were found in all the labs that had once worked with them in other cultures. And they took over other cultures. And it wasn't clear for a long time. And in the end, there were a couple of publications that showed that a lot of cell lines that people thought were a particular cell line just were not. So as in the cultivated meat industry, we need to make sure that we absolutely know the cell lines that we are working with, that we have standards established, that we have regulations established that help us to keep these cell lines pure and know what we are working with is the thing that we're actually working with. Another scandal that comes to my mind is a couple of years ago in Europe, there was a huge problem with actually horse meat being sold as beef. Something that we really want to avoid in cultivated meat is any scandal like that. If people want to eat beef, then they should eat beef. If they want to eat horse, they should eat horse, of course. Another big point in the debate currently, or something that there is no standard or agreement between the companies, is, are we dealing with genetically modified organisms and cell lines here, or do we not want to go that route? How do we sell it? What are the regulations around it? What percentage of genetically modified DNA can be in there? Then we will add medium that maybe has genetically modified proteins, growth factors in there, and so on. There's not a lot of clarity around that, and definitely something that is needs to be addressed also in terms of how do we, for example, talk to the consumers about that. As a scientist, of course, genetically modified organisms are all around us and super important for a lot of the biopharma products that we have. But also if we think of, for example, the way that we produce rennet recombinantly. So all these conversations can be started with products that we actually are already used to. And I think people would understand that without these types of biotech production, we wouldn't have that amount of cheese. We wouldn't have, for example, insulin and so on, but it needs to be discussed. And talking about genetic modifications and a way to think about it is if you look at plant breeding, there is the idea that natural breeding, whatever that is better than genetic modification. But in reality, the breeding and the selection that you do from, let's say, a plant, or even if it's an animal, you do from traits that you can see. And there might be a lot of modifications underlying that you cannot see. And by that, you may enrich for undesired traits, such as, for example, if you talk about apples, an apple that tastes super crispy, but browns too fast, things that actually happen. So genetic modification gives us an amazing range of tools. And this was only enhanced and recently, of course, awarded with the Nobel Prize, CRISPR, which is a very targeted method to change cell lines. And that's a tool that may be something that cultivated meat really can use to quickly and rapidly engineer cell lines. Another thing, and here I'm coming back to the safety part that I alluded to before, is, of course, we're not making injectables, but one story that everyone that knows the history of gene therapy is very familiar with is how one tragic case that caused the death of a human being really upended gene therapy trials at all. And that was in the late 1990s. And we could be much farther today in gene therapy than we are, hadn't this one case really stalled all research, all trials, and everything connected to gene therapy for nearly 20 years. And I think Casey also alluded to that before in her talk, where she said just how important it is that we not only claim that cultivated meat is a safe product, but that we know it is safe, that we work with the regulatory authorities on that we work together and make sure that we have safety standards so that the products that we bring out are safe. For each company out there, I think this needs to be of paramount importance in order to avoid tragedies. Of course, I'm very aware of that. People are not going to inject themselves with cultivated meat. I hope so, at least. But still, we need to make sure that we understand very well the implications of the product that we are bringing out. And another thing that I want to touch on that's important, especially for an early stage startup like us, is how do we bring down the cost of cultivated meat? And of course, a lot of that cost will be reduced at scale by scaling the process. But the underlying question for me is also, why is traditional meat so cheap? It's not like this is something that's guided by first principles and some natural law, but it's something that is guided by government subsidies and by really getting farmers to work hard and not making a lot of margins from their own products. And the farmers are caught in this need to constantly scale and make higher yields of meat at a low price, which is a problem for especially small scale farmers, because you need to go big or you can go home. And the question for me is, why should cultivated meat be also held to that same standard, that we need to reach an artificially low price? Will there be, for example, government subsidies for cultivated meat that can significantly improve the supply chain of meat and of food products? So something that can be, again, an and solution. Why shouldn't that get government subsidies in some sorts? So I think we should engage in conversations of course, we need to bring down the cost. $5,000 per pound or $1,000 per pound are too expensive. But how far do we really need to drop the cost in order to make a product that replaces part of a product that is problematic for our environment and for the animals with a product that can be produced like cultivated meat? And a little bit about Orbillion Bio and what we're doing is we really want to establish scalable cell lines for a variety of different products, something that will be needed as this industry grows and scales. And as we can see, there are already a lot of awesome companies out there making awesome products, and we need more of that. We need more products. If you look at the different desires or the different types of meat that people eat around the globe, there is not just one type of beef or one type of pork or fish. There are multiple types. So by creating scalable cell lines, by creating standards with an automated bio platform, we have the possibility to significantly improve the type of product and the amount of products out there. And I want to leave a lot of time open for also questions. And I want to leave you with this citation that I'm sure every budding entrepreneur read the book 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. And it really struck me as so true. If you think about nutrition, we all think we know a lot. A lot of us have a very strong opinion about what we put in our bodies, especially here in Berkeley and on the West Coast. But the hard scientific facts are rare and they're difficult because everybody is unique. We have unique genes. We take up nutrients differently. People eat the same things and react differently to it, some food allergies and so on. So there's just a lot of unknown, and it's really difficult to make controlled scientific studies also on nutrition because it's kind of cruel. You can't do these types of experiments. So that's where I really think is one of the biggest advantages also, and the biggest opportunities in cultivated meat, is to have meat that is nutritious, that has benefits that maybe traditional meat doesn't have, that can be engineered to be in a way digestible for people that can't eat meat and so on. So I think there's a lot still open to explore, and that's only one of the things that makes this space so exciting and so interesting to work in as both a scientist and a food enthusiast and a food systems enthusiast. So with that, I want to thank you for being here today, for listening to me, and happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Patricia, and thanks so much for highlighting a lot of the potential that a lot of us feel and what sort of draws us to this space to begin with. A few questions for you. First one is a tough question. We're starting difficult. Coming from Vince. Going back to what you were speaking earlier about the sort of the nutrient, or the loss of the nutrients in soil that comes from monoculture. The question is, if we convert to significant extent of cell culture for our animal protein supply, how do we avoid falling into that same trap of continuing crop monoculture to produce the necessary glucose, which is used as an energy source for animal cells, but also as a feedstock for microbes that might be producing amino acids and vitamins that we use in cell culture media?
Oh, that's actually a great question. And something that internally we discussed a lot. So there was a study back in the 80s that came out of UC Berkeley, actually, where they showed if people would eat only plant-based foods, we could sustain a lot more than the current people that live on the world in the future with just the land that we have then. The other thing is ruminants such as cows, for example, they should really not be fed corn. Their digestive tract is not suited for that at all. And would we let them get older, they would have significant health issues from that. They should be fed a grass-fed diet, really. So, and there are also life cycle analysis out there that show that when you use the glucose that you get, for example, from starch, from cornstarch directly for growing cultivated meat, of course, you are much more efficient than a cow is or a pig is, that also burns some of these calories for breathing and running around, the enjoyment of life, hopefully. But that's not something that we see in cell culture. I hope my cells are happy when they're growing, but I really don't care that much, to be honest. So, and another thing that we see popping up, and again, something that amazes me to no end, there are so many companies out there that are currently trying to convert carbon dioxide directly out of the air using microbes to proteins or even amino acids and other things that we can use. And again, there's so much new scientific ground to break that could show significant synergies with cultivated meat that I think we will see a lot of really fascinating innovations coming up in the next year. Next year's.
Next year's. Yeah, and I like that you mentioned this synergistic effects with other sort of sustainable technologies. A classic example is that you don't get the sustainable advantages of cultured meat until you have a green energy infrastructure. So I think keeping this in mind is really critical, that we aren't operating in a vacuum.
Exactly.
Another tough question from Vince. So from his perspective, the GMO versus non-GMO question is quite clear from a regulatory perspective, though varying between jurisdictions. But these concepts in fermentation technology apply to growth factors and even animal cells as well. But I guess the question is more about how the consumer perception and understanding of how the technologies could be used to produce, for example, feedstocks, like growth factors, might be kind of lagging. How do you propose to address consumer perception for these sorts of topics? Not necessarily, it sounds like it's going more in the direction necessarily for the product itself being a GMO, but for support products being.
Yes, I think it will depend. Yeah, consumer perception is critical. It will also depend on how much of it will be in the final product, right? How do we prove that also? Well, what will be the standard? If we look at, for example, what companies in the plant-based space are doing right now, for example, I think what Impossible did, they didn't even try to say we're non-GMO. And the only reason why they had to declare that they are GMO is because of the organism they use to produce the soy-like hemoglobin, right? And they have still some DNA of that organism in their final product, and that's why they have to declare it GMO. So will we see that the same way? Will these growth factors that are produced recombinantly, will there be some residual DNAs in there? Is there a way to purify that? All really important questions. And if we have a product that we need to label GMO, then I think it's very important to clearly communicate that. And one of the things is that we all should keep in mind is we will not make everyone happy. It's just not possible to make each and every customer on this world happy. And there will be a lot of different approaches, I think, taken by different companies. And all of these will, lead to a variety of products that different consumers then can choose and say, I'd rather choose that non-GMO product that is maybe a mixture of plant-based and cell-based or whatever it then is over the pure GMO cultivated meat product. We will see that. Storytelling, I think, is really crucial, and also the way that we address it at Orbillion Bio is that we want to create food with a story, where we say we start where I'm from in Austria, for example. Every meat you buy in a supermarket, organic meat, you have a stamp on there and it tells you the address of the farmer. I'm not sure how much farmers get harassed because of that, but it's something that we've gotten very used to. And I can see that happening for cultivated meat, Like we have our cell lines from that farmer, or Frea, for you, it might be that fisher, or however you want to play that then, to create that storyline and say, look, yes, maybe we have to use GMO, but that animal is alive. And we can prove, again, here comes the safety aspect, that it's not harmful for you to eat it. And I think that we will see consumer perception change with the years, with more companies becoming successful and bringing products out that the consumers crave, which is very important. So flavor is king, nutrition is queen.
Nice tagline, I like it. So kind of connected to what you were saying before about having this story where we know, where this piece of muscle is coming from, which animal it comes from. Let's talk a little bit about the identity of cells. So Vince, again, with the good questions, is asking, what would be a regulatory standard for cell lines? Would it focus on identity, or could it involve other biological parameters? I'm guessing like phenotype of a particular cell type.
Yes, I think that will really depend on, first of all, which product you're making. For example, are you going for an ingredient product that's a fat-only product, or is it a product that comprises multiple cell lines in the end? And what is it that we can at that point identify and tie to data? that we have, right? So it needs to make sense in either a nutritional standpoint or a standpoint that's important for the bioprocess in any way, to say, okay, we need to make sure this cell line does exactly this and this and that, and has these and these either parameters, nutritional parameters, and so on. So I think it's something where there needs to be more clarity around the cell lines, again, that we will be using, and then work on a standard that is both doable for the industry, but also guarantees that the consumer gets a safe product.
So speaking about these cell lines, I have a question about the cell lines that you guys are planning to produce. So as Aletta mentioned, and as we know, a lot of the food relevant animal species are not really relevant, or have not really been relevant for sort of medicine and biopharma in the past. So they're not really well characterized. How do you at Orbillion plan to generate these cell lines and characterize them and sort of validate what you have when these important, huge pieces of knowledge about different species characteristics are perhaps not readily available?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think somebody mentioned today also that there's a lack of open source research on that as well. So I was super glad to see, for example, the recent big grant that UC Davis got and that other institutions get. There are, of course, non-profit organizations that also support and fund open access research, which I think will become increasingly important. And then, of course, once these PhDs that worked on these projects are ready to transition to their industry job, I think I had my email address on the slides, just send me an email. So you need the people. It's really important to understand that a lot of the knowledge that we need for cultivated meat was, really from a different field. And to get the people that are interested in, as I said, the science for making food and also have the knowledge that you need, that is a bottleneck. So find someone that knows fish cell biology. It is not that easy, who understands how to both get these cell lines, characterize them, and so on. So yes, to more open access research in that will help all of us, but also, again, send me an email.
Heed your advice, everyone. A great question from Elliot from GFI, also about the sort of approach of Orbillion. So what does a business model look like for acquiring, developing, and selling cell lines to other companies?
Hi, Elliot. Thank you so much for all the work you've done. So, right now we're focusing really on accelerating the scale-up process and bringing down the cost. That's our first and most important driver. But as I alluded before, I think the cost topic is something that we need to address on the side of subsidies and then traditional meat as well. But of course, bringing down the cost and scaling up is the most important part for us. And on the side, there might be some cell lines available for others as well, of course. So currently, our focus is really on the cost side of things.
And from Anton, could you tell us a little bit more about the cell lines that you are planning to produce, that you are producing? For example, which are already available or might be available in the next couple of years? And what could be the conditions of using those cell lines? Could they be for research use, or do you intend to be more kind of exclusively maybe B2B?
So currently we're working on a couple of species. We're definitely, the most important products that consumers want is, of course, beef and porcine cell lines, and we also have some bison going and sheep. So there are some pretty interesting cell lines out there that I think that haven't been explored yet. In terms of cell lines being available for R&D, that will likely take some time, but please, definitely, if you have any interest, again, feel free to shoot me an email.
And to sort of follow up on this, Tim asks, could you speak more to the goals of Orbillion as a company? Are you trying to make meat or focusing more on a specific part of the value chain?
Yeah, so as I said, currently our biggest strength is that we have a platform technology that enables us to really rapidly scale cell lines and really also de-risk in a way the scale-up process, because we can lock in the productivity cost before we make a scale-up investment. And so the first part for us is really scaling up the cell lines that we have and then making products together with, as I said, we have some expert advisors that will be helping us with that. So definitely going for the product first approach.
And then kind of going back to the GMO topic, because we got a lot of new questions that are going in this direction. One is from Natalia, and the question is from a consumer standpoint, do you think CRISPR would be an acceptable tool to use in meat production, especially given its constant for the past few years media attention?
That's a great point. I think you're talking to the wrong person, because if I'm the consumer, I'm like, sure. As a scientist, that's something that's really hard. That's why you do market research studies, which we're currently also doing. I think, first of all, this will change in the coming years because there's also a certain amount of excitement around it. And then other things associated with CRISPR that need to be figured out are licensing costs, for example, and so on. But in general, I think we could even leverage that to our advantage. Again, you can't make all customers happy, but there are there are people that really see the potential of novel foods. And again, if you can make something that's delicious and safe to eat, I think that will convince even the people that in the beginning may be a little bit questioning if that's something that you really want to eat.
Definitely, and I think it's kind of like a rising tide lifts all boats situation. When you have a tool like CRISPR that gets a lot of positive press for whatever reason, a Nobel Prize, for example, it's perhaps, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but I would get the idea that it kind of increases general positivity towards comparable tools. Let's hope. So sort of segueing directly from this, we have another question connected to GMOs. Do you think that the proudly GMO movement will start getting bigger, keeping in mind companies like Soylent and Zbiotics, because they really use their GMO status as a big part of their branding, appealing to people like us and probably many of us in the audience?
I hope so. I don't know. I really don't know. I certainly hope so. And I see the opportunity that, these companies especially have to help also pave the way for us. And I had a really interesting experience. I went to Texas last year, and I had an Uber driver that told me, oh yeah, I tried the Beyond Burger and it's awesome. Of course, Beyond Burger is not GMO, but I was like, wow, if people in Texas are starting to eat Beyond Burgers, then something is changing. So I would say, yes, we need to bring convincing products out, products that are tasty, products that elicit a positive response. I think marketing will be super important. We need to be careful about that. So there are lots of opportunities, but there are also lots of ways to really mess this up. And we need to be careful about the message that we put out.
Yeah, absolutely. Question from Julian, kind of zooming out again. So Julian writes, thank you for noting the increasing centralization and get bigger, get out political economy that conventional meat production has grown to exhibit over the past few years in the US. How can players in the cell agriculture space partner with smaller scale farmers being pushed out of their industry so that we can avoid outcomes for farming families that were articulated in, for example, the Grapes of Wrath?
Oh, what a great question. I love talking about the parts of the farmers because I feel like often they're being looked down upon and not acknowledged enough. And I would love for the cultivated meat industry to have stronger ties to farmers, to find ways of how can they be part of the future of food. And again, I don't think we will replace these small farmers anywhere in the very near future, but it will happen at one point. So how can we make sure that they are part of this? There might be different models of a lot of farmers and ranchers that I know, for example, they have direct to consumer sales. They have premium products where they can actually make a margin. So is that something where they could partner with cultivated meat companies later on, where they could be, for example, someone that makes their own cultivated meat from their animals, right? I think this is a huge opportunity and something that we at Orbillion Bio saw also as a gap to close, because again, if we want to be a meat company, we need to understand the meat space as well, the products that are out there and the players in there. And currently the farmers are the ones that grow the feedstock for cultivated meat, but they also are the ones that, for example, make meat, right? So yes, I would love for them to be part of that new food industry in as many ways as possible, but it will take time. So it's not something that will change in in a year or two. That takes decades, really. But yeah, happy to discuss that with anyone who's interested in more detail. Again, my email address.
Reach out to Patricia, everybody.
I'm not getting enough emails as it is.
Nobody is. Yeah, no, I think you're completely right. There's so much to be learned from the meat science universe, which has been existing for 1,000 years. Definitely important to integrate these knowledge. And I think we slowly start to as we get closer and closer to actual products from the research stage. So definitely important to keep in mind.
Exactly.
Another question from Brian. Again, going back towards the cell side of things. Mammalian cell lines are used in biopharmaceutical manufacturing. They must be characterized in detail with respect to both identifying any viruses that might be in the genome and also the potential to be infected by a wide panel of viruses. The high cost of this characterization has limited the number of cell types which have been used by biopharma. Will Orbillion provide that level of virus safety characterization regarding your cell lines?
That's a super good question and something that I really don't see being asked enough. Viral contamination, of course, is a huge issue. And I think especially with the situation we're in right now, the COVID situation, this will become even something that will be more scrutinized, right? So there are ways, of course, in biopharma to test for exactly that. And I think it will, again, the difference between biopharma and what we're doing is we're not injecting everyone with our products, right? So that is a huge difference between an injectable product and an ingestible product. But of course, that's something, again, that we need to work out with regulatory to find out what exactly is safe. What do we need to test for? And yes, at Orbillion, we definitely want to be part of that discussion because, you know, we are founders that have experience in biopharma, years of experience there. So we know how to talk to these regulatory agencies as well. So it's very important to be part of the discussion and learn alongside others because nobody has ever done it, right? Nobody has brought out a commercially viable cultivated meat product and has been asked, so what's the viral load on that, right? So yes, something that's super important.
And kind of coming off of this quality assurance perspective, could you maybe walk us through where cultivated meat might have an advantage in making sure that we have correct species identification?
Yes, sure. So, and I love quality assurance.
Potential risks, classic meeting.
Quality assurance is my favorite topic. For anyone who doesn't know, I used to be an analytical scientist. So this is something that I think in terms of species identification, again, it comes back to what I said earlier, that first of all, we need to have the right tools to really say, oh, this is this species. Sequencing is something that becomes cheaper and cheaper day by day. So there are ways to definitely prove and say, hey, this is exactly that cell line. If you have GMO cell line, of course, there's ways to say, okay, this is exactly the cell line that we have. But what I also want to focus on is if we bring a product out that has, for example, mixed cell lines, right? That is also the point where we need to make sure if we work with a couple of cell lines to avoid cross-contamination and to make sure that the product we're bringing out is, I don't know, 20% muscle and 80% fat, for example, is easier than to say 20% duck and 80% salmon, for example, right? Whatever we will see coming out there. And that sounds actually not very appetizing now that I think about it.
Yeah, well, let's see. You never try, you never know. Another great question from Brian, again, at the level of Orbillion as a company. Would there be value in Orbillion partnering with a medium and bioreactor supply company like Merck or Sartorius to provide a turnkey solution? For example, a set of pre-optimized matched cell lines, media, and bioreactor that any manufacturer could reliably put into manufacturing, kind of connecting again to this decentralized production idea.
Yes, turnkey solution sounds great and sounds a lot easier as it probably is. But in general, I think we will see a lot of movement in the entire cultivated meat space as more of the technologies become more mature and more widely available. But yes, right now, I think all of us or most of us are dependent on partners in the space to some extent. And we will see which of these methods that each company or multiple companies bring out will be in the end the one that will succeed. So I think I am very convinced that we need a lot of partnerships in the industry to work together for these solutions. And, you know, in biopharma, we have a lot of CMOs, CROs, contract manufacturing organizations that are being worked with. And that has been a very successful and very flexible concept, especially if as a company you plan on expanding quickly, where a small startup doesn't have, of course, the network that maybe a larger company such as Merck has. So I think there is multiple possibilities to really serve a $1.4 trillion meat market with all the products that we want to serve in a couple of years, to partner with other companies, definitely.
Great, thanks. So maybe connecting again to this idea of many options that are available for us right now. A question coming from Tim about the kinds of cells do you think that might be present in the first generation of culture meat products? So the question is, do you think that it'll be primary cells? Do you think it'll be immortalized cell lines, some sort of genetically modified cell, reduced pluripotent stem cells, some combination thereof? What do you think is the most likely to arrive on our plates first?
That's an interesting question. If I from the product that we saw out there so far, I mean, there's so much breadth in that, right? And so much, oh my gosh, that was my German accent. There are a lot of different products out there, right? So I think we will see products out there that are maybe, I don't know, 80% plant cells in the beginning, because I think the concept of hybrid plant-based, cell-based products is something that's really, really big. And then the cell-based part, it will depend on what regulatory says and how we can communicate the cells that we have are safe, and that, or, you know, if there's a problem with, again, GMO and regulations, especially Europeans really don't like the whole GMO thing, then that might be something where you say, okay, it's primary cells because that's the only thing we can get through regulatory. It's really a wide space right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it kind of connects to this idea that you mentioned earlier that, you know, it's not always first principles that determine which things end up being more widespread or less widespread. It's not that there's necessarily an inherent advantage to one or the other. And if there are, there's normally some sort of, you know, balancing acts and sort of competing risk. So yeah, definitely a difficult question to answer in a vacuum. Question from Carol, zooming out again to the level of the whole industry. What can we tell ranchers and farmers to help them embrace the changes in our food supplies and removing animals from the equation?
My opinion is that we can't tell farmers and ranchers anything. They know very well what they're doing in the field that they are in, right? The small scale, one thing that we need to understand is that the farmers that farm animals, they have a relationship to their animals. They are proud of their animals. There is a decade or even century-long breeding program behind that. There is immense pride in what they do. And I think that's something that we need to understand and value as scientists, to not come off as we know better. Honestly, we have no clue. I was out there with farmers when we had the millet project, growing millets. I saw them working their butts off for us to get food on our tables. That's what farmers do. They don't need us to tell them what to do. What they need is an honest dialogue that shows them the opportunities that they have in the future of food. So, for example, I know that there was a paper recently that came out on how cultivated meat can reduce the number of livestock out there, right? And if we can say, hey, dear farmer, for cultured meat, we need, I don't know, primary cell lines of that quality, then, and with certain properties, and the farmer is like, great, if I can make money from that, I can breed my cattle, my pigs in a way that is perfectly suited for cultivated meat, for example, right? So then there's a difference there in that, for example, we don't have to have that high volume of animals and they don't have to be killed for that. So giving them opportunities to make their own decisions and talking to them as equals is, I think, the best recipe for future collaboration in that space.
And I think you raise a really interesting point there, which is that the value of a decreased flock is actually, like, per animal is much, much higher, because suddenly from one animal you have the potential to feed, you know, thousands of people, whereas before you only had a few. So I think keeping that in mind in these dialogues, that the individual value of those products goes up, even though the scale goes down, it's an important trade-off to keep in mind. So kind of maybe a fun question. Will sourcing cells from different animal breeds actually result in different tasting meat? And is there any data to support this? Do we have any, do you have any sort of anecdotes perhaps of being able to actually taste differences in species?
So I know that in the past, people have tried to grow different muscle cells from animals and said that they don't taste differently, and that the actual difference in taste comes, for example, and mouthfeel comes from fat, right? There is still very few people that had the opportunity to taste cultivated meat off different species. And a lot of it will depend on the preparation of that as well, right? The meat that we eat is usually something that has gone through many different processes that change the original cell type. So to really bind flavor to different breeds, that will something that remains to be seen on how we can do that. But for that, we first of all need to scale up so we can have more material, so that we can taste all these different things, right? And that's going to be another very important milestone, I think. As I said, flavor will be the thing that will convince the consumer. So how will we get different flavors? How will we get flavorful meats? And also, how will we still keep it kind of a clean label product in a way where we don't have to add additives to actually make it taste like meat?
And Stefan, who asked this question, maybe it would be a good poll to raise in the Slack for this community, because I'm sure there are some people who are in our Slack community who have been in this population of people who've been lucky enough to try some cultured meat, hopefully from different species. Maybe they'd be good sources for that question. I'm also very curious. So kind of coming in at the end of our Q&A session here, I have a question from, I'm going to mispronounce your name, Sahan, maybe? And the question is there a way that a non-engineer person can experiment with DIY in vitro meat without expensive equipment in a non-commercial way?
No, it's not going to be easy. I mean, that's maybe a really good question for Integriculture. I think they're speaking tomorrow or on Wednesday. They know more about that, about how to make that happen. And I think there's a movement to do that. I would be a little bit concerned again about safety again. Maybe that's just me, but it's definitely going to be hard in an inexpensive way currently. Couple of years down the road, maybe not.
Yeah, the Shojin Meat Project is the sort of DIY, maybe biohacker approach to cultivated meat. So yeah, definitely check this out if you're interested in DIY meat production in your own kitchen. Maybe not scalable in a safe way, as we mentioned at this point, but definitely an interesting endeavor. So with that, Patricia, I want to say thank you so much for your time and your really interesting perspective. Looking forward to everything that Orbillion will bring to the table soon. And if you have any lingering questions for Patricia, please throw them in our Questions to Speakers Slack channel. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks, Frea, and thanks everyone for attending.